And O'Connor said about that, she says, first of all of my thoughts on this are ugly. She says, I think it's an awfully long way to come and get shot at. And there she's expressing something that is, again, we see so often in the letters, Northern Yankees coming down and telling the South how to deal with its racial problems. So she resented Dorothy, even though she admired her. She resented her for dabbling in things she shouldn't dabble in. But then she apologizes at the end of the letter by saying, I hope that to be of two minds about something is not to be neutral. And that just struck me as such a great image for what we see when we read O'Connor's letters, and we read them beside the stories. Because in the stories, so many of them are so sensitive, and they're so good at getting at the complex relationship between blacks and whites in the South and portraying them with a great deal of subtlety and nuance and sympathy. And then we read the letters in which we see there's not a great deal of sympathy and subtlety, at least in a number of the letters, when it comes to racial issues and also issues surrounding civil rights. So I felt that this book was really going to be about this balance, this scale between the two minds, the one that wants to be on the right side of history and knows that segregation is wrong and that Black Americans should be treated with equality. And then the other side, which is deeply ingrained, she uses the word inburnt, with a deeply racist culture that she has grown up in. And how does a person deal with those two minds? And thus and the word radical, some people take the word radical to mean somebody who is an extremist. I'm using it in the sense of at the root of something is its root. Yeah, so at the root she is ambivalent. And ambi, of course, in the Latin, it means two. So she's literally of two minds about something.
Yeah, yeah. You really in the work do kind of lay out kind of the terrain of how do we talk about race today? How do we look at race historically over the last 60 years of the dismantling of the Jim Crow South, and how terms like whiteness studies or white privilege has been a kind of a way to understand the kind of a culture in which you kind of get indoctrinated, or you learn almost like you breathe in a kind of racist vision of the world because of your whiteness, right? And I think it's really important when I teach students Flannery O'Connor, we have to spend some time with that notion that I think Flannery O'Connor would say everyone who's white will be racist, because it's kind of that almost inborn, she would I think call it original sin, or something like that. She would use a theological language, but I do think, would you agree that there's something about, there's no perfect human being. There's no perfect white person, no perfect black, there's just no perfect human being in any of her stories. And the ones that get the most violently shaken are always people like her, a white person.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned talking with students about this, because actually, one of the reasons I decided I needed to write this book is because my conversations with my students, I've been teaching O'Connor for decades, and the conversations have grown much, much more fraught, complicated, and interesting in many ways, because students they're just so much more sensitized to issues of race, to these these things that you were just talking about. And so stories that maybe 20 years ago I could teach as a straightforward, kind of anti-racist story, like everything that rises must converge. It's like, oh no, they're not buying it when you try to talk about a story that way. And I myself had often felt I was uncomfortable with O'Connor's stories, but I didn't really couldn't figure out what the source of that discomfort was. When I wrote this biography of O'Connor a couple of years ago, Fiction Fired by Faith, I was least happy with chapter 7. Chapter 7 was the chapter on race, because I knew that I did not dig deep enough. I didn't have the wherewithal to dig deep enough to find out what I needed to find out. So the book came about really as a result of I wanted to address this more from a standpoint of knowledge with my students, and be able to get at my own discomfort. And so, yeah, it's perfectly in keeping with what we all have had unfortunately, a very slow kind of wake up call, white Americans, in terms of our complicity in racism in this country. It's been going on, of course, for over 400 years, but it's really only in the last 4 decades, 3 decades, that people are really beginning to wake up to it. And we do have language for it now that helps us to understand where we start. And of course, as we all know, no one is born a racist. This is something, as the old song goes, you have to be carefully taught.
Yeah.
You have to be taught how to hate. You don't learn that coming into you're not that as an infant. And so we have these huge sinful structures of sin, is the Catholic way of talking about it.
Yeah.
But we have these huge structures, social structures, which are inherently racist against all people of color, but particularly African Americans. And owning up to that is the first step in terms of being able to identify yourself as being complicit in all of this, because you participated in those structures and also you benefit from them.
Right.
And so the definition of racist has changed. It used to be, oh, that's just a horrible person who uses terrible racial epithets and means violence against people of color. That's no longer a definition of a racist. It's a particular kind of racist, but it's not the only way to be a racist. To be a racist is really to participate in these structures, to benefit from them, and not to be critical of them and not try to dismantle them. And that's where we find ourselves. And it's a new way to look at O'Connor as well as also being complicit in all of this.
Right, and of course we've got these two. I think you call them almost like two legs. You've got the letters, and it's specifically letters to her mother, to her friend Marriott, to her friend Betty Hester, where we do see this kind of racial banter, even maybe racist confession. Certainly with her mother, I've not seen those, but I've heard those are the worst. But it's also this intimate relationship with her mother, who grew up in that same world, and so what's going on there between mother and daughter. Her friends, it's a little bit different. I think with Marriott, there's a bit of playfulness and transgressive humor, even if it is a slur. She's pushing Marriott, who works for civil rights, but it was a working for civil rights. And they had a deep friendship. And then you have Betty Hester as well. In my research, I've not seen it beyond that. Really, it's really been kind of focused on those almost confessional, intimate relationships. But it does expose the fact that she's very easy with these kinds of using this racial slur. And yet, so that's one pole, right? And then you have her art, which seems to me, all of her short stories are not, especially her short stories, are really a kind of a deconstructing of her own culture, her white culture. There's that wonderful line that O'Connor says, it is the Christian novelist's duty to unmask the devil that possesses us. And I think she's unmasking her own devil, as well as her mother's and her towns and the South and the whole country in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. O'Connor understands racism from the inside as a person who has watched other people practice it, but also who has racist feelings herself, obviously, as is evident in the letters.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important parts of the book, or most important emphases of the book, is the fact that, all right, so what do we do? We do have these letters which testify to the fact that there's no doubt that she says she does not like African Americans. I don't like Negroes, she says, and she emphasizes that word. And she also names particular people she doesn't like James Baldwin, like Martin Luther King. She does like, as she calls it, Cassius Clay, because she thinks he's a realist, but I think she also likes him because he's a separatist, because he's a Muslim at the time, and he's all for a kind of segregation as well. So there is this sense in which, in her letters, she does give us this portrait of a person who is very much, in many ways, a person of her time, has the usual prejudices and marks of bigotry that most people who lived in the South at the time did. Not all, certainly. There are obviously exceptions to that. And also the other thing is, those of us who love O'Connor's work and love O'Connor want her to be one of the exceptions as well. We very much want her to be one of the exceptions. And so it's very disappointing for us to find out that she's not. I have to say, it was I knew about those letters because I had heard other scholars speak of them. And then when I actually went to the collection and saw them, and Mark, perhaps you had a similar experience, it was really, really distressing
Yeah.
to see it in her own handwriting. And to, I mean, it's like I use the expression in the book, a smoking gun. I really felt like I was looking at a smoking gun, and there was no way that I could defend this, these words or these thoughts that she was having. So yes, that's the one part of this exploration that is very disturbing. And then you're left with, well, how do I make that person, how do I square that person with this person who writes these stories that are so telling in terms of the way that she does deconstruct race, the way that she does get to the heart of what goes on in the heart of a violently racist person and expose it. And then also another thing that I think is so brilliant about O'Connor's stories, and obviously I'm not alone in this, is the way that she is able to depict the complex relationships between blacks and whites, the performative aspects of that relationship, the line that black people have to walk, the code that they have to abide by.
Yeah, the manners by which, you know, they have to live by so that they live, that to survive in a culture where they're always under threat. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of that, so you really do have this bifurcation between the letters and between the stories. And I mean, I think what we have to acknowledge is that people are, first of all, are amazingly complex. Art is amazingly complex. I mean, as an artist, I think I'm no Flannery O'Connor, Lord knows, but I'm somebody who writes on a regular basis. And so I know that there's a difference in the mode that I'm writing in when I'm writing some sort of discursive essay and when I'm writing a poem or when I'm writing a novel, a piece of fiction. Something else takes over. There's something larger than yourself that happens. As O'Connor says, when a writer is writing, she is revealing to the world a mystery, and she also might be revealing to herself a mystery that she does not understand. So there's a kind of exploratory mode that a writer goes into when he or she is creating something. It's a different mode of discourse than when you're just chatting away in a letter. A letter is like a chat, right?
Yeah.
And so fortunately, something else happens when O'Connor is writing her stories, so that there is I really feel as though not all, but many of her prejudices, many of her inburned impulses towards dislike or towards bigotry just sort of fall away, and she's really able to cut through to the real, as she says. A novelist lives in hot pursuit of the real, right? And so in that hot pursuit, she's able to drop the stuff that maybe is not so real.
Right.
And that comes out in the stories. There are, however, tells where you can't lose it all.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that's why I love that word that she uses, unmasking the devil and that possesses her. There's an unmasking that's going on in her stories that are there. I also want to go back to the letters though, because I did a lot of research for this film, and we read Father McCoon's letters, we read letters from Billy Sessions, I talked to so many people. She also was very much aware that the civil rights was here to stay, and that she understood that this was the future, and that this was the arc of, and especially with Father McCoon, there's a real sense that he's doing spiritual direction with some of the letters that they have. So there is this, I don't want people to be taken away like, oh, everything she wrote and every confessional thing was this racist kind of character. Not that, I don't want to take away from that, but at the same time, I read 90% more letters that show a woman who is mannered, of course, so she's not going to maybe talk in those ways with her priest or with Billy Sessions or with someone else. But at the same time, you see her probing those same kind of questions and saying that in many ways, the future is not segregation, right? The future is not. So her personal either ambivalence or dislike of Negroes. She's already inundated with the sense that there's something wrong with that, and she carries that burden with her in that. So I just wanted to say that before we kind of move more to the stories, because I don't want people to get the idea that this is everywhere and everything, that you can just pick up any letter, right? It's really disturbing. It's frightening, at least. I've never seen them. I know I've heard about the women, the ones to her family, her immediate family, and I know that those are the most colloquially disgusting, are the ones. Yeah, so I just wanted to. Do you agree with me on that
Oh,
regard?
absolutely. I think, I mean, I chose to focus on 4 different passages that had never been published before as a way of, and they're different in kind. Each one is a different, performs a different kind of function in terms of demonstrating her attitudes towards race. There were more that I could have used, but I thought that these were key. But I have to say, looking through the many, many letters, I don't know how many there were, but it's not as though, oh, it's on every page. That was not the case at all.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing that comes out in the letters, so for example, O'Connor, when a few months before she dies, she's reading Thomas Gossett's book on race, the history of that idea in America, which is basically it's an amazing book, way ahead of its time in many ways, which exposes the fact that race is a social construction. There's no such real thing as race, really. And she's reading the book, and she writes to him in one of her letters and says, "I'm reading your book with great interest." Father McCoon came by, and he took the cover. I wouldn't let him have the book because I knew he wouldn't give it back to me. But I'm so happy to have your book. And so here she is, a few months from her death. She's not well. She's suffering. And what's she reading on her deathbed? She's reading this book about race, the history of an idea in America. And of course, he lost his job as a result at Wesleyan College in Macomb, Georgia, because he was doing all of this, what was seen as transgressive writing about race. And she felt she saw the injustice of that. So I think, first of all, one thing that is very obvious to me, and I think is probably obvious to most of us who know and admire O'Connor, she died at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. She died in 1964.
Yeah, the civil rights legislation just happened. I mean, it was just right then. So she was at the beginning of that dismantling and that kind of revolution, yeah.
And she was on her way to a better understanding, a fuller understanding, a richer understanding of her own complicity and all of this. And also, I think she would have been more charitable as time went on. Theoretically, O'Connor could still be alive in our moments. So it's the fact that she died at 39 and the fact that she died in the middle of all of this did not give her time to work her way towards the fuller understanding that many, not only Southerners, but Northerners came to as the civil rights movement unfolded. So yes, that's absolutely a very good point. So in her letters, you even see the ambivalence in her letters.
You do.
Yeah.
Especially with Marriott Lee, because there's that one letter where she first meets Marriott Lee at Milledgeville, and she has to go to the airport or something, and I guess it was an African American who drove her to the airport, and she's got that one line about she's talking about how ridiculous it is. She says, "This would be funny if it wasn't tragic." I mean, even she's saying to Marriott Lee, I mean, it's tragic that this is the kind of mannered world in which this is the biggest news and gossip going on, that an African American drove you to the airport. It's tragic that has to be the news. And so you even see, even as because with Marriott, she's really pushing it. And of course, we'll get to Revelation, because I think this is Marriott, and I think the whole short story is really a response to Marriott Lee's, cajoling, friendship, to release her from some of those white privileged kinds of complacencies that she likes, she would say. So, but we'll get to that, I hope, in the next few minutes.
I can interrupt just a little bit. We have a lively discussion already going on in the background. And one of the things that people are interested in is how she adapts a certain redneck persona. And but there's some discussion of, well, even if she adapts that persona, does it really excuse her from what happened from her letters? But then somebody else said because in reference to your Baldwin question, is hatred a necessary part of racism? And then someone also asked, well, we always hear what she thought of Baldwin. What did Baldwin think of her? So go for any of those.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, she did like to set, well, taking on the redneck, I'm just a Southern girl kind of persona was a way also of deflating intellectuals, who she always felt like she did not want to be associated with in any way, even though obviously she was an intellectual.
Big time,
Big time intellectual. So this is another mask that she dons. And this is something that writers do. You put on masks. You try things on. It's a part of one's imaginative life if you're an artist, and see what it's like looking at the world from that perspective and writing from that perspective and inhabiting that space for a while. And so that's one of O'Connor's strengths, that she's able to do that. And then in the next moment, she's writing a very learned letter about the theology that she's been reading in Romano Guardini's latest book, and how that squares with Thomas Aquinas. Like she's able to move in and out of these various cultures. And of course, that's part of her identity. She's a Catholic in the Protestant South. She's very, very much loves the South and loves its culture, but also has been to the North and has seen the world from that perspective as well, and now come back and brought her perspective with her. So I think that's all part of O'Connor's ability as an artist, and having what Henry James calls a histrionic imagination, and being able to inhabit these various ways of being and write truthfully from those various viewpoints.
Jill, I want to say something a little bit about Baldwin, because obviously as we were doing our own film, 2015, we started in 2013, and Black Lives Matter happens, and race became very much a bigger part. It just grew organically as a bigger part of our film on Flannery. But I was helped a lot by Hilton Als, the New Yorker critic, because we pushed him on the Baldwin, and for however much she liked or disliked or hated, he said, well, to have met him in Milledgeville, she could not be the journalistic person writing about this anymore. She'd be found out. She would be unmasked. And so he says, in some ways, they could never meet as artists there. And she does say in the letter, I'd be happy to meet him in New York, anywhere else, but I'm not going to meet him in Milledgeville. You'll see a mule, I think, fly before I will do that. But I did think that was, so this idea of hate, I think he becomes an emblematic of a kind of some of the strands of civil rights and civil discourse around race that she's still getting comfortable with, and she's not comfortable with at all yet.
Yeah.
So that's just my take on that question that somebody asked, is that I'm not sure there was a kind of a vilification and a hatred of him, but he kind of represented a kind of an argument that she was not ready to have. Certainly not in a place where she was. I mean, the properties of her people were Milledgeville, and she didn't want to be exposed by having that civil rights event as opposed to two artists coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. She writes that letter about not having Baldwin visit her in Georgia in 1959. So she's somewhat familiar with him, but not as much as she will be when she writes the note in 1964, where she says, I don't like him because he's a pontificating, prophesying kind of Negro. And at that point, she says, he can talk about life in Harlem, because that's what he knows. He grew up there, but he can't talk about life here. And once again, it's the same way she felt about Dorothy Day, who we spoke of a few minutes ago. People who don't belong here and haven't been raised here and don't understand the South coming down and telling us how to live our lives. And
it's a deep conversation in the South throughout, even today, I think, I mean, I'm not from the South myself, but it seems to me, I hear that in the kind of that's still kind of like a, how dare you speak when you're not from the region. And so as much as it was huge in her time, I still think it has its own kind of reverberations even in today's discourses, political and otherwise.
Absolutely. And another thing that really strikes me about O'Connor and Baldwin, it just so happened that while I was writing this book at a faculty reading group, we decided to read The Fire Next Time, which is just such a great prophetic book, right? 1963, but it could have been written yesterday, or it couldn't be written tomorrow. But there was one particular passage in Baldwin. When I read it, I was struck with a as with a thunderbolt, because it struck me that this goes on in O'Connor too, and I'll read the passage if it's okay from The Fire Next Time. He says, the Negro came to the white man for a roof, or for $5, or for a letter to the judge. The white man came to the Negro for love. But he was not often able to give what he came seeking. The price was too high. He had too much to lose. And the Negro knew this too. When one knows this about a man, it is impossible for one to hate him. But unless he becomes a man, becomes equal, it is impossible for one to love him. And this idea of this white desire for love from Black people, we see over and over again in O'Connor. We see it in that moment in Revelation where Ruby Turpin turns to the Black workers that she's giving water to and tells them her secret about what happened in the waiting room. And they don't respond with love. They want sympathy. They want, and they give her, the pantomime response that they have to give.
Asbury in the enduring chill with the two in the cow barn milking the cows, the same thing.
Exactly.
He just wants to be loved by them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what O'Connor and Baldwin both end up on the same page, and that like as long as there's no equality, there can't be love between them. So as much as she disliked Baldwin, she and he were in many ways doing the same work. It's just looked at it in different ways.
Yeah. So we I think anybody who reads her and certainly then delves into the letters and certainly delves into your book sees the contradictions. I don't want to put it off as a kind of a Catholic theological piece, but Flannery O'Connor has this analogical imagination where she's holding contrary things together and puts them into some kind of creative tension to create something, right? And really, what do we talk about when we talk about the sacramental imagination or the symbolic imagination? We're saying that basically symbols bring two things that shouldn't be together into some kind of relationship, and that causes a motor to happen or an energy. I mean, who hasn't read a Flannery O'Connor short story and said, how does this and how does this and how does this and how does this work? And then all of a sudden it's boom. And I think that if that was her artistic kind of vision, I think it was also her spiritual vision too. And that she herself, I think, understood and also decided that she could live with these as you say, radical ambivalences, these contradictions. That's my take on it. Having done this film, having talked to so many people, having read your book. So last word on that, and I really would let us go to some stories and we can just flesh this out in a few stories. Anything else you want to say?
No, just to add to your observation, the Catholic writer Ron Hansen often talks about the Catholic disposition towards the world is not a one or the other. It's a both and disposition. And you can be just like Ruby Turpin. How am I a hog and me both?
Yeah.
Well, what you are, and we all are. How am I a sinner and also a lover of Jesus at the same time? Well, you obviously can be. So yeah, I agree that both and is very much a part of who she is spiritually, as well as how it's her way of being in the world.
Yeah, and certainly becomes the artistic way she creates drama in her stories, for sure. You frame throughout your book, which I really loved, kind of the bookended stories of her life, right? The geranium, then reworked and reworked and reworked and reworked to become a Judgment Day, to one of the final things she's doing before she dies. And of course, you've got the same kind of characters played out there. What do you see happening between the first story, which she writes, which seems to be a little bit more polemical, maybe, to me, and then that final story, which is much more complex, and it seems like she's getting into the texture of the white privilege in a new way. So I just really love the fact that you could bookend beginning and end and say she's grappling with this her whole life, not just at one moment.
Yeah, that was a revelation to me as I was rereading the stories with a particular eye towards this issue. And the fact that she writes that story when she's away at Iowa, right? The geranium is the first story that she writes. It's the first time she's out of the South. It's the first time she's really above the Mason.
It's also the first thing published.
First time for an extended period, she's above the Mason-Dixon line. She's living in an integrated world where there are actually African Americans in her classes at Iowa. She has a friend there, Gloria Bremerwell, whom her mother warns her against befriending, and Flannery basically says, "You can't tell me what to do." So she's suddenly inhabiting this world that is not as highly segregated. It's still segregated, but not as highly segregated as the one she comes from. And lo and behold, she writes this story about an old man who lives in the South and decides to go up and live with his daughter in New York City, and discovers that it's a whole new world. Now, obviously, as O'Connor said, I couldn't write, and I can never write anything autobiographical, but I do know something about homesickness. And so in a way, that character Dudley is her own self transplanted into this new world, and trying to figure out how to operate in it. And I think you're right, that first early story it's apprentice work. She's a young writer. She's trying to figure out how to manage these very big, complex issues. And it's very much an allegory of this old Southern man's discovery of the fact that his sense of himself as a white person is absolutely dependent on having a black other, his friend Raby, who he leaves behind, and he's separated from him, and then he doesn't know who he is anymore without that relationship. O'Connor says in one of her unpublished writings that the Negro is the dark shadow self of the white person, and obviously this is what she's working out. But the story is very simple and straightforward. You know, he has an incident in a hallway with a black man who lives in the building, and he's utterly shaken by it, and he goes back to the apartment, and he's kind of just destroyed. Whereas she rewrites it not one time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. And
more violently. How much more violent then? There's our Flannery,
he's killed. I think our sense of the guy is renamed T.C. Tanner. Tanner dies as much as a result of that dispensation as he does as a result of, at the hands of the black actor who kills him or assists him on his way through allowing him to have either a heart attack or a stroke in the hallway. So what we see there is just and also the other brilliant thing about that story as it is in the rewritten the final time, and who knows, she might have rewritten it again if she had lived. I wouldn't put it past her. The final version is that the relationship between Tanner, the white man who goes north, and his black other, Coleman, is so absolutely central to who he is. All he wants to do is get back to him because he can't be who he is without that. And the other interesting thing that she adds is this sense of race as being a construction and a continuum, because Tanner is described as a yellow-skinned man. He's not white. He's kind of yellow. And also the girlfriend of the black actor who he sees in the hallways is described as a high-stepping yellow girl. And so there's a sense in which the differentiation in color, that clear division between black and white that so many people want to see, does not exist in the real world because race exists on a continuum. So in all sorts of ways, she's really interrogating the principles that she was writing according to when she was, a 22-year-old student in Iowa.
Yeah. It's phenomenal that she comes back to this late in her life. She still feels like that story has something she had to work out, and it's really a question of, as you say, I need the black other to be me, to be white, and without that unfair, unjust relationship where I can be lord of the manor, I don't know my whiteness. I don't know who I am. And of course, that last moment where he's like almost in the bars of the stairwell, looking like it's the white man who is almost in prison. Obviously, over like we've imprisoned ourselves with this sense of this whiteness, that our comeuppances is that we have imprisoned ourselves with this injustice. So let's go to Everything That Rises Must Converge in Revelation, because I think these are the two that, for me, really speak to O'Connor's, religious imagination as well as her imagination around race. And you do a wonderful job with both of them. I think Revelation, of course, is the #1 story. But let's go back to Everything That Rises Must Converge. It's such a book of where her theology kind of says, I stand here in this cosmic kind of stance, because obviously it uses Teilhard de Chardin's great line that, everything that rises must converge. There's no converging going on in this story, at least in the human particular concrete story. But there is this kind of hope only in a religious vision that could have. So tell me about how you unpack race, white privilege, and the kinds of dynamics, the interior dynamics of the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. You mentioned that the convergence doesn't happen. I think actually another way of looking at it is the convergence does, but it's a violent one, as is typical of
Okay.
O'Connor. It's not the gradual divinization and everybody is lifted up. It's like these two forces come and violently change one another irrevocably. One of the things that was really striking to me, or is really striking to me about that story is, as O'Connor says, the topical was poison. I never write about the topical. I got away with it in Everything That Rises because I said a plague on all your houses on the race thing. And that is a very telling, it's one of those, it's again from the letters, it's a very telling statement, because a plague on all your houses. So on the racist mother, obviously there should be a plague on her house. On her son, who pretends to be, liberal-minded, but is a closet racist and just really wants to use Black people for his own ends. A plague on his house, but also a plague on the Black woman's house, who finally strikes the mother at the end of the story. That's hard for us to, I think, 21st century post, or Black Lives Matter post civil rights people to wrap our minds around. There's a problem with that, because okay, everybody is a sinner, no question about that. That's just straight up Catholic theology. But some sins are worse than others, and I think that pretending that that's not the case, or depicting a story in which that's not the case, is problematic for us, because we're not able, I think, to see the story in the light of eternity in the way that she wants us to see, alluding to Teilhard. That what fools these mortals be, that sort of thing is problematic for us, because, well, first of all, as you know, she's writing for a very secular-minded audience. But even those of us who aren't secular-minded, we have been shaped by the civil rights movement, by the history that we have lived through, that we have seen and seen documented. And we can't set all that aside and look at the story in the way that I think O'Connor wants us to look at it. So what I do in my analysis of the story in the book is take a look at some other sources who have something to say about the characterization, particularly of the Black woman. If you remember the passage where she's first described, where she gets onto the bus, she's described as looking angry. She has her lip is her bottom lip is jutted out as if she's looking for a fight. She's described as a giant of a woman. Giants generally aren't nice people. In the fairy tales, they eat people, they dash their brains out, they do all sorts of things. She's a very scary presence. And she's also described as a very ungainly, large woman, whereas Julian's mother is always described as very diminutive, childlike. When she's sitting on the bus, her feet don't touch the ground. They dangle like a child. And he talks about her eyes being this innocent blue. And so there is this kind of disturbing paradox set up with this woman, this angry Black woman, and this innocent racist white lady. Now, of course, a lot of this we're seeing through Julian's eyes, so we have to take that into account. But nonetheless, it's very obvious that you've got these two people set up in opposition to each other. And then, of course, they're wearing the same hat, which is the source of the convergence that happens. Toni Morrison talks about, I talk about Toni Morrison's ideas about the way that Black bodies are represented in American literature, and also Sean Copeland's book about enfleshing freedom, and particularly with regard to this female Black body, which ought to be regarded as a site of divinity, a human sacrament, but it has been desecrated by slavery. The matrix of slavery has overwritten it. Yeah. And also another source that I bring to bear is Mary Douglas, the British sociologist, where she talks about the fact that we have physical bodies, obviously, but we also have social bodies, bodies that are perceived in particular ways because of our history, because of our race, because of our gender, whatever, our ethnicity, whatever it might be. So I think it's very interesting to see in that story and in some other stories as well. Julian entirely perceives that woman based on her social body. She's really not a human being.
Right.
And the fact that she has been, one way of looking is she has very good reason to be angry. 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and all of the ways in which women in particular have been subject to rape, to unwanted children. I mean, it's very hard for us not to see that woman in the context of that history, and to see her body in the context of that history. So it seems to me that there's much more going on in the story that O'Connor is probably not aware of. As I mentioned earlier, an artist, to a certain extent, you have your authorial intention. You sit down and you mean to do something.
Well, she says that in the Harvey Bright interview too. She says, we sometimes the mystery where we know there's a mystery there, and it only comes to us after the work is done. We only get it ourselves as artists. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I find that to be, and also again, she uses doubling very, very wisely in that story. With Julian is the son of the white woman, and little Carver is the son of the black woman, and they exchange places at one point. And it looks as though they've exchanged sons. And so there is this attempt, again, the black other, the black double, that is the other half of the white person, the shadow self. All of that I think is very well managed. But there are these the ways in which the limitations of her own vision show, and I think that happens in terms of the characterization of.
It's really interesting. So I've had a dozen conversations with Karen Coonrod, because of course Everything That Rises Must Converge was performed, and I've also talked about it with my students. I had Karen come when we were at Georgetown, and I had the students write a reflection about is the African American mother justified in her violence, and they all say yes. Our students, this generation, gets the fact of that pent up anger, gets the fact that she could. So it's just very fascinating to me that, again, how do we read this story through our own historical kind of moments? That I'm thinking that there's going to be a conversation around this in the classroom, and they were basically no, she was justified. So to your point, I don't think O'Connor would have ever thought that as well, that she was justified in that violent act. But yeah, most definitely. Well, let's go to Revelation, and because I know we have questions for people too, and I think we've got just a few more minutes before we invite Irene back to ask some of those questions. But I really, having done the film, and more and more, we knew that Revelation was the final coda of the film. I think it's her best story. It's certainly the most perfect story for me. And doing research on it, realizing how much Marriott Lee is a part of this story, talking to Marriott's family and seeing the fact that in some ways, obviously, Mary Grace, goes north for college, and so does our little girl, and so does Marriott. So there is a sense that she's really kind of almost working out that friendship and trying to honor that friendship, and really coming to honor the fact that, she's, to Flannery O'Connor's credit, she never says to Marriott Lee, what you're doing living up in Harlem is stupid or is dumb, or matter of fact, she says just the opposite. Remember when Marriott was threatened by a phone call, and she writes that letter saying, listen, you take care of yourself, you keep on fighting for what you think is right. I mean, so that relationship, I think, is just really important as a way to think about not so much race, but that Marriott handed that almost as a platter to Flannery and said, do something with this. Our friendship is at this kind of moment where you have to do something. So I preface that because I think you do a marvelous job helping me understand some of the kind of consequences. But how do you unpack Revelation as a kind of story? And certainly that ending, I'll stop talking because I'll keep on talking. I just love this story so much. But that ending where, you have that biblical kind of moment of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And O'Connor kind of almost giving in, with Ruby Turpin yelling at God, yelling at the cosmos. Oh, how come it can't be the way I want it to be? So please.
Yeah. It's I mean, I think you're absolutely right about this being a working out of the relationship, the friendship between O'Connor and Mariette Lee. There's that wonderful letter where she talks about, it's a good thing Mariette sends her a picture of herself when she was a child, and she says, oh, I recognize you anywhere, and she says, it's a good thing we didn't meet when we were younger, because we'd have set the place on fire, you'd provided the fuel, and I'd have lit the match.
Right.
She recognizes in Mariette somebody who is a troublemaker like herself, and admires her. And so for all of the teasing and all of their differences, they love and admire each other. And that comes out so clearly in the story. The Mrs. Turpin is, I love the way that she looks. Well, I don't love it, but we admire the way O'Connor depicts her looking around the room and sizing people up according to their shoes, and she's just she's so incisive. She's got a narrative for everybody, and we all know that's exactly how Flannery O'Connor conducted herself when she went to the doctor's office. She wasn't necessarily looking at people's shoes, but she was putting a narrative to everybody in the room, because that's what writers do, right? Especially fiction writers. So here she creates a version of herself. She refers to her in one of the letters. She said, she just came so naturally to me. She just full born into the world. And it's like, well, it's kind of because she's you. That's one of the reasons she comes so naturally to you. So she has this affection for Mrs. Turpin. And this is often very hard to convince students of, because they think, oh, she's just a hateful racist. And it's like, well, she is a hateful racist, but she also has affection for her. Again, this both and, right? And then, of course, poor Mary Grace is a version of Mariette Lee. And she's, of course, the angel in the Annunciation. She's the angel Gabriel. She's the one who gives Mrs. Turpin a chance, because otherwise she's definitely going to hell, the way that she conducts herself. And so Mary Grace hits her in the face with the book, and then leaves her to go and think about her sins. Which she does, to her credit. Again, Mrs. Turpin's such a great woman, because somebody else would have just blown it off and said, oh, that girl was a lunatic, so I don't have to pay attention to her. Right. Instead, Mrs. Turpin goes home and she can't stop thinking about what it is that's been said to her, because she is a person with a conscience. She is a person with a soul. That comes across in the way that she talks about her dreams at night, where she loves to classify people according to what race and how much money they have, and then before she goes to sleep, she dreams of them all being shipped off in boxcars to ovens, because she knows at some level that is deeply, deeply treacherous, sinful behavior that she's exercising. So there's this goodness in Mrs. Turpin that needs to come out in some way, and Mary Grace helps that to happen, just like Mariette Lee helps this to happen with Flannery. And so all things then move towards that last scene, which is just so hugely iconic. It's such a great moment in O'Connor's stories, because as we know, she asks God, "Who do you think you are?" And God answers her, giving her three visions. The first vision is of the smallness and insignificance of human beings, because she sees Claude, and the field hands get into an accident, imagines them, and they're all dead on the road. The second is that beautiful image of the pigs cowering in the corner, who seem to be suffused with life. They pant with a secret life. And so she says, okay, there's the creation is shot through with God's glory, with God's grandeur. I didn't see that before. And then, of course, she sees the purgatorial vision of all of the souls rumbling up into the sky, heavenward. And of course, all of the people that she despises are in the front of the line, and she and Claude, who are the supposed good people, are in the back. And interestingly, even their virtues were being burned away. And that is such an important moment for Mrs. Turpin, obviously, because she sees herself in the way that God sees her. The first shall be last. She finally gets that scripture that she knows so well. And she has a lot of sins that she needs to have purged from her. And all of these other people, I think it's also, though, one of the things I find fascinating about that final vision is it's a very hierarchical vision.
Yes.
And Flannery knows her Dante. It's the contrapasso. So the sin that Mrs. Turpin regularly commits in her life of putting people in a hierarchy, she sees the hierarchy, only it's not a hierarchy she likes, because she's at the bottom rung rather than at the top rung, another image that she uses. So it's definitely hierarchical because we're seeing through Mrs. Turpin's eyes. She still uses the N word. She doesn't describe them as Negroes. That's not a word that's in Mrs. Turpin's vocabulary, and it still isn't, despite the fact that she's in the process of a kind of conversion experience. And also, interestingly, the people in the front of the line are not behaving very graciously. They're not walking in time and singing the hymn. They're leaping like frogs, and they're clapping, and they're being disruptive in all sorts of distasteful ways. And I think that that's interesting as well, because it does betray a little bit, again, of that racist element that is inburnt, that's not going to come away. It's not going to happen all at once, right? So it's a very telling moment, and it's Mrs. Turpin's come to Jesus moment, but it's also Flannery's come to Jesus moment.
And I love the fact that you have that bit of almost a pause, and then you have the crickets, and she hears hallelujah. It's like, and we as readers, like, hallelujah. I mean, to read all of Flannery O'Connor's stories, I feel that hallelujah is finally, oh yes, her character gets to live and get it, even if it's just inchoately and through this kind of vision, but it is a conversion moment, and she gets to live into to something, and I do think it was really in homage to her conversations with Marriott Lee, and really being invited in, if not to leave her white privilege, certainly to be disarmed, but to disarm her racist kind of senses of life and privilege. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And that's also part of that ending. I think that's very telling. Is she's going to be walking a darkening path.
Yeah.
O'Connor talks about conversion as being a lifetime experience. It's like a blast of light, annihilating blast of light that lasts a lifetime. So this is the first blast for Mrs. Turpin, and there are more blasts to come. So you really have this sense of, this is a hard journey, this is a hard road, and she is going to be walking in that purgatorial vision. So it's, and yes, I do think that Marriott in many ways serves as this sort of this voice within O'Connor herself. She is a kind of other self for O'Connor, who tries to keep her honest, tries to remind her of what it is that's right and true.
Yeah.
One of the reasons she keeps on engaging with her, she doesn't just write her off, it's because this is somehow life-giving to her.
Right. She knows something is to be gained in the best sense of the term there. It reminds me of that phrase that, because I think this really kind of sums up where we kind of landed, is that, O'Connor says, all human nature rigorously resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful. And I think O'Connor was aware of the need to change, and how painful it was to give up one's comfortability, the manners that privilege me and make my life easier but make your life miserable, all of those kinds of things. And then having these characters just have their worlds turned upside down and say, none of this matters. I'm not the master of my universe. Oh, okay. And I say master of the universe because I do think for her Catholic worldview, that's how she kind of sees whether we can do it easily or not. I remember Alice McDermott saying, we don't think this way anymore. We don't have that idea. But O'Connor had it. She just had that idea that there was a cosmic kind of vision, and that cosmic vision was one of faith and redemption by a God who redeems us. So maybe Irene, I think we've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Are there any questions you want to pose to myself or Angela?
Sure. There's a few themes that people have been working around. One of the themes that I'm seeing a lot of is people asking questions. Starting with what you said at the beginning, Angela, about how do you teach O'Connor in the current age, and depends on your audience and are your students at it from an HBCU? Is it a community college student? Is it a Georgetown student? How diverse is your classroom? You know, all of these things, particularly now that Black Lives Matters has resurrected again and shown us some of the challenges. How do you teach O'Connor to undergraduates and to high school students, for that matter?
Well, I know I'll say a few words, and then maybe Angela respond too. But so I teach at Flannery O'Connor Seminar. It's 24/7. It's all Flannery. It's all we do. And the very first day I sit and we spent over an hour saying, how are we going to deal with the N-word? And I try to kind of give some context. I said, I'm going to have us speaking out loud, but I don't want to hear that word. And I know that will traumatize some students in this room. So how do we, so first they have to write a little bit, they have to think about it, and then they kind of talk. And so I really allow the students, at least in my, where I am, to kind of lead the way about how they want to engage this. And that has really helped. So for last time I taught this, every time the N-word came up, the student read the word and saw the word, but read out loud Negro. So you felt the dissonance of 1957 to 2019 when I was teaching it. You felt it by not saying the word, but seeing the word you felt that kind of tension. So that's one way, I think, just to deal with how we start talking about that word, because we have to deal with that word at the beginning. Angela, that's how I at least start my seminar. Do you have other things? I have other things like we do too, but I think that's really an important part of it.
It certainly speaks to the issue I brought up at the beginning with the reason I wrote this book is because I'm finding myself teaching differently than I did 20, 30 years ago. I used to, teach a regular survey of American literature, and, two central books in that was Huckleberry Finn, which of course has a difficult, history, and the N-word comes up there in important ways, and then Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I used to make it, as Mark does, call attention to the word, but we did use the word because it was very important that Huck used that particular word, especially when he's got his conversion moment, and even as he's saying, or acting as though he thinks Jim is a person, he's still using the N-word. I would not do that now in the classroom. First of all, I do teach in a place that's not very diverse. It's New York City, it's the Bronx, but for whatever reason, we just don't have a lot of African American students. We generally will have a couple in a classroom at the most. We'll have some Latino students, but mostly we have white students. And I'm very aware of the fact of how uncomfortable my Black students would be if a bunch of white people in the room were throwing the N-word around. It would just be extremely painful. So it's not a word that I use. I don't model it, and students don't use it. So if we're reading the story, The Artificial N-Word, which is a story, unfortunately, I don't teach as much as I used to because of the complexities. I had a student who was giving a report who would say the artificial, he just wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't speak it, a white student, again, out of respect for his classmates. So I think it's very important to honor that situation that are young, and they're very young too. That's the other thing. They're not people who are used to being oftentimes in a mixed classroom where they're a minority and people are having this conversation. So to try to not make them uncomfortable is very important to me. However, I would have a problem with a student who wanted to substitute Negro for the N-word, because O'Connor goes to great pains in her stories anyway to differentiate between those two words. So for example, in the story of Revelation that we were just talking about, Mrs. Turpin, you'll remember, has that moment where Jesus says to her, you know what, there's only two places left for you. You could either be a white trash or you could be an N-word. And Mrs. Turpin says, oh my God, I don't know, which should I be? And then she finally decided, okay, just make me an N-word, she says. And then the narrator says, and then she became I can't remember exactly what the language, a clean, respectable Negro. And there's a huge amount of dissonance between the word that the narrator uses, Negro, and the word that Mr. Turpin uses. So I think it's important, as you say, Mark, to talk about the word and what the word means. And I spend like a half a chapter, I think, on that in the book, just to kind of talk about what it meant to O'Connor in her time, what it meant to Southerners, different parts of the South at the time, and what it means to us. And also the other thing is, you know, we live in the era of Dave Chappelle. We live in the era of wonderful comedians and hip hop artists who have taken a lot of the air out of the word and repurposed it, and that's how you get power over language, to repurpose it. I don't have the authority to do that in the classroom as a white person. I don't think I have that authority and ability to do that. So we have to change our teaching, I think, in order to be able to reach and not alienate the students that we have in front of us.
It is interesting. So one class decided to use that, and I let them do that because that's what they decided. And the other one used the word black. Usually it tends to that they want to find a different word to use. But to teach Flannery O'Connor today is to teach the mechanisms of white privilege and the kind of unconscious racism that's just structured into to our world, to our American world. And students seem to always get that. Especially if you know, I mean, okay, again, it's maybe obvious, but seeing that kind of dismantling of all that privilege in her characters is really I think what really galvanizes students to continue to read. That in the sense that I think of the violence, always trying to figure out how is this violence, you know, helping this character or helping the story along. Those are the two things. I was asked to give a talk at Xavier University in New Orleans, which is the only started by Catherine Drexel for an African American community in New Orleans, Catholic school, and it was a whole room of African Americans and people of color, and it was a really wonderful. I wish I had that experience because I learned so much from the way that they circled the story and talked about the story. Of how much it resonated even with them, and especially about the social codes and the manners and that sense of their life under that, even in 2018 when I was there.
Well, actually, we have a comment about how to teach has just blown up in the comments, and one of the people who has commented also teaches college in Annapolis, and so George, you were talking a little bit about what you see as a teacher.
Well, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I guess I did have an experience. This is going back a number of years now. And so it's before the current ruckus. But I had an experience where in a seminar, we were studying Huckleberry Finn. And so I don't know how much you know, I teach at St. John's College here in Annapolis. There's called Great Books at college. And so our classes are all discussion classes, and so we're going to talk about Huckleberry Finn this night, and so the word is prominent. Nigger Jim is Nigger Jim. There's no getting away from that. And so and this particular night I had the question. I was opening the seminar with a question about the novel, and I simply asked, and somebody actually mentioned this in the chat, but I brought up the fact that the word was present in the story. We were going to talk about it for a couple of hours. And so it was going to be hard in a certain kind of way to talk around it. But the one thing that I asked, I said, if you're making a comment or raising a question and you're quoting from the book, that's fine. I would prefer that no one uses the word nigger in his own voice.
Yeah.
That was the request I made at the very outset of the evening's discussion. But you know, what was the outcome? The outcome was nobody ever said the word. And I think that has a lot more to do with the moral education of students currently.
Mhm.
I mean, my experience over the years, and I have to confess, I've taught many more white students than I have black students. But my experience over the years is that um, for a young white person coming to college, the very last thing that they want to be accused of is being a racist or racially prejudiced, or however you want to have that. And so that was, that was what I learned again that night, was that no, I'm not going to say that word at all. I'm not going to mention it. I'm certainly not going to use it. Um,
Yeah.
it's just one of these things that seems to, for the most part, have been taken care of beforehand. Now, does that mean that nobody's ever going to say the word, or no white person is ever going to say the word? I think we all know better than that. But again, that was my teaching experience. That's what I did. If you're mentioning it in the context of a story, then you're saying what's there on the page. But please don't start talking about niggers in your own voice. So
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have a place in public discourse anymore. It's something that, and I think that's absolutely a great point, because these kids have been educated to know that that's just not appropriate to do. And unfortunately, they will, I'm sure some will use it in other contexts, but at least those of us who are professors in the classroom, we have control over this space, what happens in this space, and we're modeling for them, how you talk about these things. And they're as much learning that as they are whatever it is, the stuff that we're teaching them. So I'm always very aware of that. They're watching and they're listening very closely.
Another sort of area of question is sort of, and again, this is when I was doing my dissertation, one of my readers asked me, defending my dissertation, asked me what the future of English studies was, and the other guy said, no, you don't have to answer that in dissertation defense. But this is kind of in that realm. Is we tend to, with Flannery O'Connor, very much go into the biographical, because if you go to Milledgeville, it feels like being in one of her stories. To what degree is that fair? Is that right? Is that an issue? Either one of you.
Yeah.
Great question. It's inevitable, because she left behind such a great trail. She's got the essays and Mystery and Manners. How can we pretend not to know about those essays, which tell us so much about her own practice as a writer, her own spirituality, the intersection of those two things. She left behind these letters, which they're like Keats's letters, and Keats is a comparable figure, I think. We read Keats and we love Keats, but we also know Keats's story, and the poignancy of the story helps us to understand his work better. And that's true of any artist. Knowing about their life is important for us to really be able to. Well, we never can fully understand them, but understand them as fully as possible. I do know that there are critics who bristle against reading the stories according to the way that O'Connor tells us to read them. They would rather them just kind of stand on their own. But I just don't think we can not pay attention to this, because it's an enormous gift, the fact that and there are times, as we've acknowledged in this conversation tonight, where she's not absolutely right about her work. There are times when she's trying to do a thing that doesn't exactly work. And I think that happens, for example, at the end of the story, The Artificial N-Word. What she wants that statue to represent, I don't think it represents it for a lot of readers. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to know what she's aiming for, and to be able to bring that to bear on the story, just as it's important to be able to bring to bear on the story when she says, I say a plague on all your houses in connection with race. So I'm, I guess, one of those critics and readers who think of all of this as a gift that we have, and enables us to understand O'Connor better than we would without all of it. Mark, I'm sure you feel so much.
I feel the same. I mean, there's such an integrity, even with the warts and real sinful reality of race and racist feeling. There's an integrity to her. You said why does Flannery O'Connor love Ruby Turpin? Because she has enough integrity to fight God with, like, who do you think you are? It's the same reason my students sometimes say, well, you know, the misfit actually does have a point. He's the only person with any integrity, even though he's a crazy man and a psychopath. And in some ways, she's got that. I'm not saying she's the misfit, or she's more Ruby Turpin, but there is this sense that the integrity of her life is about how does faith, culture, and craft kind of come together. And these stories are, we can excavate a religious dimension, we can excavate cultural dimensions. We also excavate that kind of craft, as you were saying. When does it work and when does it not work? But because she talks about it so often, and because her letters talk about it, because her essays talk about it, and because in some ways we keep on coming back to her stories, there's this real place and this real space, and she creates. I mean, she really believed that there was such a thing as a regional writer, and she was kind of, you know, and she creates Milledgeville, she creates the South, and especially for a lot of readers who are from the North, who don't have access to a kind of a tradition or a history fraught with all of its racial injustices. So yeah, I think you're right. I guess I love Flannery O'Connor because of that integrity. The unflinchingness. Mary Gordon in the film says she's one of the few writers that was not afraid to look at the darkness and look it squarely on. And that's her own darkness as well. I mean, I think she transports herself as a property of her characters just as much as her mother, Regina, just as much as, you know, anybody, the town clerk, whatever it might be. All those properties, Eric Lancaster, the properties come together from the life that she lived.
Absolutely. And I also think that the other gift that they give us is we see her operating in different genres. She is in one of her, in the higher mathematics journal, which Mark comments on, she says, my epistolary powers astonish me. She thinks she's going to make her living being a great, you know, a great letter writer. So she puts a lot into her letters, or that journal, the prayer journal, which is a series of letters to God. So this is another way in which she's exercising that, using that genre. She doesn't write much poetry. She sends one poem to Sally Fitzgerald and says she thinks it's a filthy habit for a fiction writer to get into. But she does make the attempt every now and then. And of course, as a child, she wrote poems all the time. And then, of course, the essay, the art of the creative, you know, nonfiction prose is on display. Not all writers are good at talking about what they do. They just do it. But she is. So we're just really fortunate to see that she can work in all of these different genres. And so I consider them to be artful, as well as the stories being artful.
And you know, one of the things that I've also learned from doing this film, especially talking about the film I was at the National Press Club with Elizabeth Kaufman, my colleague, and we were talking about the film in front of this group in DC, and one person returned and says, I don't like Flannery O'Connor. I don't like her stories, and gave some good reasons why. And I thought to myself, of course, you know, some people are not going to relish this kind of story. They're going to find something very problematic about it. And so there is this sense that, you know what, she's not for everybody, but I do think that she represents a moment in time, and she also represents a kind of gaze or a vision of what the human person is, and she unpacks it, she deconstructs, she dismantles so much going on that there's always this kind of thing. And I think that people who like her craft are fascinated with it. The line that Toby Wolf said from Stanford, Tobias Wolf, the writer, he says, you know, when I teach Flannery O'Connor, I say, you don't have to become Flannery O'Connor. You have to go through her, because you will learn so much about the craft of writing and probably about life when you get to the other side. And then you can discard her and become the writer you want to be. But it didn't make it into our film, by the way, that line. But I've always appreciated that line. You've got to go, if you want to be that she has a lot to teach in terms of craft, and she adequately gives dramatization to the human experience in an adequate way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the experience with many people. For example, I remember years ago we used to have a parish book group, and we would read, different writers. And I made the mistake of, saying, let's read some Flannery O'Connor stories. And I mean, these are very dear people. They were horrified by the stories. And I was reminded that, these are tough stories, and everybody, most of the people who remark on them say, they're so cruel. In fact, Marilyn Robinson says, I see very little grace in Flannery O'Connor. She doesn't like Flannery O'Connor stories, which is mind-boggling to me because I love Marilyn Robinson. I love her trilogy of novels. I think she's a wonderful writer. And I also love Flannery O'Connor, and they're very different kinds of writers, and I think they should both be who they are. I see grace in both of them, and it takes different forms. But I've also heard O'Connor accused of not liking her characters, and I just think that's not true. I think she really does. She's very, as we know, she has no room for sentimentality at all. So she is not going to coddle them or baby them. God knows what would happen if she ever became a parent. Can you imagine? I often wonder what the experience of being babysat by her for the Fitzgerald kids might have been.
Not fun.
Not fun. She's all about really tough love, so if you don't like tough love, you're not going to like Flannery.
Yeah. I think we're running out of time, and we still have a lot of great questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the chat and send it to you, Angela and Mark, Father Mark. And if you have anything that you want to comment on, we can send it out to the whole group, or you can send it to the person involved. Okay?
Sure. Thank you. These are, by the way, really great questions. I so appreciate hearing them and getting your feedback. I wish that we could do more of that, but obviously when there are 100 people in the room, it's a bit hard.
But thank you everybody for showing up tonight, and it's been wonderful seeing you. And thank you, Father Mark, and thank you, Dr. O'Donnell.
Thank you.
And we will see you all soon.
We hope so.
Yes.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.